A Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd inherited an abandoned fire tower, and the first thing they found inside was a secret someone had buried for decades. An abandoned fire tower stood above the town, silent for decades, holding secrets that only one person had listened to. Inside that tower were old radio recordings, hidden truths, and a choice that could either destroy the town or protect it.
Control, this is Lookout
But when a
4 Alpha.
wildfire
The tower
suddenly
is active.
rose from
We
the
have a
northern
massive
forest,
wildfire moving fast
the
on
forgotten
North
tower
Ridge.
had
We
to
need
come back
immediate
to life
assistance.
again.
We've got
As the
confirmed
radios
spotting
crackled
past
and the
Brightwood
town
Ridge.
gathered
I need
below the
those
mountain,
crews diverted to
the
the
soldier
north right
slowly
now.
realized his
Copy
grandmother
that.
hadn't
Diverting
left him
all
a building.
available assets.
She had left him a
10 minutes.
responsibility.
Elias,
And just when the fire was finally under control,
they know we're here.
a strange voice came through the radio
You
from
must
far
leave the
away,
dog.
asking a chilling question. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you more powerful stories. The highway into Brightwood Ridge curved slowly through the northern mountains, like an old memory that refused to straighten out. Pine forests stretched on both sides of the road, tall and dark green beneath a sky so clear it looked freshly washed. Patches of old snow still clung to the shaded ground, even though spring had technically arrived weeks ago. The mountains in the distance rose like quiet witnesses, their peaks white and distant, reflecting pale morning sunlight. Elias Mercer drove with both hands resting steadily on the steering wheel. At 38, Elias had the kind of build that came from endurance rather than vanity. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, about 1.83 meters, with a compact, disciplined frame. His shoulders were broad, but not bulky, the muscles beneath his clothes shaped by years of practical movement rather than gym mirrors. His face was clean-shaven, no beard, no stubble. The sharp line of his square jaw and high cheekbones remained fully exposed, giving his expression a permanent look of quiet focus. His dark brown hair was cut in a military style, short on the sides and slightly longer on top, just a little longer than standard SEAL regulation. It had grown out enough to suggest he was no longer in uniform, but not enough to look careless. His skin carried the pale tone of someone who had spent much of his life outdoors in cold climates, weathered by wind rather than sun. His eyes were a calm gray blue. They rarely moved quickly. They watched. Elias wore the same clothes he had worn most days since leaving the Navy, a faded olive gray tactical combat shirt that had softened with age. The cuffs and shoulders were slightly worn, the fabric showing pale streaks from years of washing and exposure to weather. His combat pants were old military issue, earth brown with olive undertones, creased at the knees from long use, the cargo pockets sagging just a little. On his feet were heavy work boots, the leather dark and scuffed, but still dependable. Around his wrist sat an old military watch with a black rubber strap. Nothing about Elias Mercer looked expensive. Everything about him looked reliable. Beside him in the passenger seat lay Orion. The German Shepherd was 5 years old and in the prime of his working life. His coat carried the classic yellow-black pattern of the breed, with a deep black saddle across his back and warm golden fur along his sides and legs. His muzzle was dark and sharp, his ears tall and alert. Orion's amber-brown eyes were half-closed as he watched the forest slide past the window. He wore a black working harness trimmed with a thin, dark red edge. A small metal tag hung from the side ring, engraved simply, Orion. The dog had served 2 years with a military K-9 unit before injuries during a deployment ended his official service. Elias had taken him home, not out of charity, out of understanding. Neither of them had quite known where else to go. The road. Sign appeared suddenly from behind a line of spruce trees. Elias slowed slightly. He hadn't been here in nearly 15 years. Brightwood Ridge sat in a wide valley between mountains, surrounded by endless forest. A frozen lake glittered faintly in the distance, its surface fractured with thin lines of thawing ice. The town itself looked almost peaceful. Small buildings, a gas station, a diner, a hardware store with sun-bleached tools hanging in the window. Everything looked exactly the way a northern mountain town should look. Clean, quiet, safe. And yet Elias felt the same sensation he used to feel during reconnaissance patrols. The feeling that something about the landscape was too still. Orion lifted his head, not abruptly, just enough to change the angle of his ears. The dog inhaled slowly. Elias noticed. "What is it?" he murmured. Orion didn't respond with a bark. He simply stared ahead. As Elias drove into the center of town, he noticed something else. People were watching him, not openly, but deliberately. A man pumping gas paused mid-motion. Two women near the diner window lowered their voices. A teenage boy carrying groceries slowed down long enough to look directly at Elias through the windshield. It wasn't curiosity, it was recognition. But Elias had never lived here. He had only visited his grandmother a few times as a child, and yet the looks followed him. Not hostile, just measuring. Orion suddenly sat up. His body went still. The dog's eyes fixed on something beyond the buildings. Elias followed his gaze. Up the mountainside. High above the town, half hidden by tall pines, stood a narrow structure made of weathered wood and steel. A fire lookout tower. The structure rose above the trees like a forgotten lighthouse, its small observation cabin perched high on thin metal supports. The tower had once been used to watch for forest fires decades ago, before satellites and modern sensors made such posts obsolete. Most lookout towers across the West had been dismantled years ago, but this one remained, standing quietly, as if waiting. Orion did not move. His ears were pointed forward with surgical precision. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The dog had reacted like this before, not when he sensed danger, but when he sensed something unresolved. Orion stood suddenly in the passenger seat. He placed his front paws against the dashboard, staring toward the tower. Not barking, not growling, just staring. Elias frowned. The dog had done this once before, in Afghanistan, right before Orion had detected an explosive hidden beneath a road. Elias studied the tower again. Sunlight reflected faintly off the windows of the small cabin at the top. For a brief second, he thought he saw movement, a shadow. But when he blinked, the windows were empty again. Orion let out a low breath through his nose. Not alarm, recognition. Elias looked away from the tower and drove on. He parked outside a small roadside motel at the edge of town. The motel owner was a middle-aged woman named Sarah Whitcomb. Sarah was tall and thin, with a posture that suggested years of standing behind counters and telling people where things belonged. Her light brown hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, streaked with early gray. Her skin had the pale, freckled tone common among people who had spent decades in cold mountain air. She wore a thick cardigan the color of moss and rectangular reading glasses that rested low on her nose. Sarah greeted Elias with the polite caution of someone used to strangers, but not entirely comfortable with them. "You must be Mercer," she said, checking a small notebook on the counter. Her voice was calm but curious. Elias nodded once. "Just a room." Sarah studied him for a moment longer than necessary. Then her eyes drifted down to Orion. "That's a working dog," she said quietly. "It wasn't a Question. Orion sat calmly beside Elias, his posture neutral but alert. Elias answered simply, "He used to be." Sarah nodded slowly. People in small towns tended to understand animals better than explanations. She handed him a key. "Room 7. Then she hesitated, just for a second. "You here for Margaret Mercer's service?" Elias felt the name settle inside him. "Yes." Sarah's expression softened. "She was a good listener," she said. Elias wasn't sure what that meant, but the way she said it made it sound important. Night arrived early in Brightwood Ridge. Cold air slid down from the mountains, and the forest outside the motel became a dark wall of whispering branches. Inside the room, Elias sat on the edge of the bed. Orion lay on the floor near the door, always facing the entrance. Elias held a single envelope in his hands. It was the last letter Margaret Mercer had sent before she died. The handwriting on the envelope was careful and steady. Elias had never been close to his grandmother, but she had written to him every year, always short letters, always strange ones. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, just one line written in neat blue ink. "If Orion begins paying attention to the tower." Elias read the sentence again, then finished it quietly. "It means it's time for you to hear what I used to hear." Across the room, Orion raised his head. The dog's ears pointed toward the mountains, toward the place where Fire Tower 17 stood in the dark. And for the first time since Elias had arrived in Brightwood Ridge, the dog did not look relaxed. Morning in Brightwood Ridge arrived quietly, the way northern towns often woke. Without hurry, without ceremony. Thin sunlight spread across the valley and climbed slowly over the pine ridges, brushing the rooftops with pale gold. Elias Mercer had already been awake for hours. Old habits did not dissolve easily. Even after leaving the Navy, his body still rose before dawn, alert long before the rest of the world remembered it had responsibilities. Inside the motel room, Orion sat near the door. The German Shepherd had chosen the spot himself sometime during the night. His body rested in a relaxed crouch, front paws extended forward, but his ears remained angled toward the hallway outside. The dog's breathing was slow and steady, though his amber eyes opened briefly when Elias moved. "Still guarding?" Elias murmured. Orion's tail tapped the floor once, the kind of answer that meant yes. Elias finished lacing his boots and checked the old military watch on his wrist. The scratched glass caught a thin line of sunlight coming through the curtains. 9:14 a.m. The reading of Margaret Mercer's will was scheduled for 10. Outside, the town had begun to move. Pickup trucks rolled slowly down the narrow streets. The diner's neon sign flickered to life in the morning cold. A delivery truck parked near the grocery store while a teenage clerk unloaded crates of canned goods with exaggerated patience. Elias stepped out of the motel room. Orion followed close at his side. The air smelled like pine needles and distant snow. It was the kind of air people in big cities paid money to breathe on vacation. Yet the town still carried the strange quiet Elias had felt the day before. People noticed him, but they didn't approach. They watched from small distances. The law office sat near the center of town, squeezed between a barber shop and a small insurance agency. The building itself was older than most of the others, constructed from dark wood that had been weathered by decades of mountain winters. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The receptionist looked up as Elias entered. Her nameplate read, Clara Donnelly. Clara appeared to be in her early 60s, a broad-shouldered woman with short silver hair that curled slightly around her ears. Her face carried the soft wrinkles of someone who had spent many years smiling politely at strangers. She wore a navy cardigan over a cream blouse and round reading glasses that rested halfway down her nose. Clara looked first at Elias, then at Orion. Her eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Well," she said in a warm, practical voice, "that's not the smallest client we've had in here." Orion sat calmly beside Elias, his posture professional and composed. "He's well trained," Elias said. Clara nodded. "I can see that." She leaned forward slightly. "You must be Margaret Mercer's grandson." "Yes." Clara studied his face for a moment longer than necessary. Then she smiled gently. "She talked about you sometimes." Elias wasn't sure what to say to that. Clara gestured toward the conference room. "They're already waiting." The conference room held 8 chairs around a polished wooden table. 6 of them were already occupied. The first man Elias recognized immediately: Sheriff Nolan Briggs. Briggs sat near the far end of the table, his broad shoulders filling the back of the chair. He was a tall man, around 55, with thick gray hair cropped short and a heavy mustache that had once been black, but had since faded into silver. Years of mountain weather had carved deep lines into the corners of his eyes. His sheriff's jacket hung loosely over a plaid flannel shirt, and his badge reflected a dull flash of light as Elias entered. Briggs did not smile, but he nodded once. Across from him sat another man who did smile. The smile did not reach his eyes. Harold Kettering. Kettering was younger than Briggs, perhaps around 50, though the careful way he carried himself made him appear slightly older. He was tall, close to Elias's height, but broader, with the confident build of someone accustomed to command rather than physical labor. His blonde hair was neatly combed back, touched lightly with gray. His jaw was clean-shaven, his expression smooth. He wore a green field jacket over a white collared shirt and dark trousers that looked expensive enough to avoid the dirt common in mountain towns. Harold Kettering owned the largest timber company in the region. Even Elias knew that much. The rest of the people at the table were distant relatives, faces Elias vaguely remembered from childhood gatherings that had always felt more formal than affectionate. At the head of the table sat Martin Caldwell, the town's attorney. Caldwell was a narrow, deliberate man in his late 60s, with thin white hair and sharp cheekbones. His voice, when he spoke, carried the careful precision of someone who had spent decades choosing words for a living. "Mr. Mercer," Caldwell said, "thank you for coming." Elias took the empty seat near the door. Orion lay quietly beside him. The reading began. Properties were listed, savings accounts distributed. A cabin near the lake was left to a second cousin, who nodded with polite satisfaction. The process moved steadily, until Caldwell reached the final page. His voice slowed slightly. "Margaret Elaine Mercer leaves the following property to her grandson, Elias Mercer." Elias did not expect much. Margaret had never been wealthy. Caldwell continued. "Full ownership of Fire Tower 17 and the surrounding forest parcel." The room went quiet. Then someone chuckled. A man near the back leaned toward his wife and whispered just loudly enough to be heard. "That old tower's been abandoned since Reagan was president." A few others laughed softly. Sheriff Briggs did not. He watched Elias carefully. Caldwell cleared his throat and continued. "Along with the tower, all equipment contained within the structure is transferred to Mr. Mercer." Then he reached into a small wooden box. He removed a single object, an old brass key. The metal had darkened with age, its edges worn smooth from years of use. Caldwell placed it on the table in front of Elias. Engraved into the surface were 2 words. "Radio room, your grandmother requested this be given directly to you," Caldwell said. He paused. There is also a note explaining its relevance. Caldwell adjusted his glasses. Margaret Mercer served 20 years with the United States Forest Service as a radio dispatcher and wildfire communications coordinator. Several people in the room exchanged glances. Caldwell continued calmly. After retirement, she volunteered to maintain listening equipment at Fire Tower 17. No one laughed this time. At that moment, Orion stood up. Not abruptly, but with purpose. The German shepherd's ears tilted sharply toward the rear hallway behind the conference room. A low vibration formed in his chest. Not a bark? A warning? Elias followed the dog's gaze. The hallway door stood half open. For just a second, a shadow moved across the glass panel. Then it was gone. Orion's growl faded. The room had not noticed. Everyone else was still focused on the will, but Elias had seen it. Someone had been standing there, listening. The meeting ended shortly after. Chairs slid across the floor as relatives gathered their coats. Harold Kettering approached Elias before leaving. Up close, his smile appeared more practiced than friendly. "Your grandmother always did have a sense of humor," Kettering said. Elias looked at him. "I'm not sure what you mean." Kettering gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "That tower." His tone remained light. "But if you decide to sell the land, my company would be very interested." Elias said nothing. Kettering nodded politely and walked away. Sheriff Briggs waited until the room emptied. Then he approached. Up close, the sheriff smelled faintly of coffee and winter air. "You planning to go up there?" Briggs asked quietly. "Eventually." Briggs studied him. "You should know something first." Elias waited. Briggs leaned slightly closer. "Your grandmother didn't just listen for wildfire reports." Elias felt the same quiet tension returning to his chest. "What did she listen for?" The sheriff's eyes moved briefly toward the hallway door, then back to Elias. "That," Briggs said slowly, "depends on who was talking." He straightened. "Just be careful up there." Orion had already moved toward the exit. The dog paused at the doorway. His nose lifted toward the cold mountain air outside. Elias followed him out. The mountains stood silent above the town. And somewhere up there, Fire Tower 17 waited. The road leading toward Fire Tower 17 was little more than a narrow forest track, half swallowed by pine needles and old gravel. Elias Mercer left the truck where the path grew too steep for wheels. From there, the mountain demanded the rest on foot. Orion stepped down from the passenger seat and stretched slowly, his front paws digging into the cool earth before he shook out his thick yellow-black coat. The German shepherd's body moved with the smooth, controlled strength of a trained working dog. At 5 years old, he was still in his physical prime, lean, powerful, alert. His ears were already upright, listening. Elias closed the truck door and looked toward the ridge. Fire Tower 17 stood above the tree line like a thin, skeletal structure rising from the mountain's spine. The tower's metal supports looked older than most buildings in town, weathered by decades of wind and winter storms. Sunlight flashed briefly against its windows. From this distance, the structure looked abandoned. But Elias had spent too many years learning the difference between something that looked quiet and something that was quiet. "All right," he murmured to Orion. The dog was already moving. The climb took nearly 40 minutes. The forest around them was thick with lodgepole pine and spruce. Fallen needles softened the ground beneath their boots and paws, absorbing sound until even Elias's heavy work boots made little noise. Orion moved ahead in a wide zigzag pattern, not wandering, searching. The dog's nose lowered to the ground occasionally before lifting again to taste the air. Every few steps he paused and listened. Elias watched the behavior with quiet familiarity. Military dogs didn't walk. They swept terrain. The forest remained peaceful. Too peaceful. Birds called from high branches. Wind pushed softly through the needles. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a woodpecker struck bark with steady rhythm. Nothing seemed disturbed, but Orion never relaxed. About halfway up the ridge, the path narrowed beside a rocky outcrop. From there, Elias could see the valley below. Brightwood Ridge looked smaller from this height. The streets formed a loose grid between patches of trees, and the lake reflected the sky like a sheet of dull glass. The town appeared calm, orderly, almost innocent. Elias turned away and continued climbing. When they reached the tower clearing, Orion slowed. The dog's posture changed. His tail lowered slightly. His steps became measured. The clearing itself was small, just a patch of flattened earth surrounded by tall pines. Fire Tower 17 rose nearly 60 feet above the ground. Its steel legs bolted into thick concrete anchors. The staircase spiraled upward along the outer frame. The structure creaked faintly as the wind passed through its metal supports. Elias studied the base of the tower. He expected rust, dust, signs of neglect. Instead, he saw something else. The ground beneath the first steps had been disturbed recently. Not dramatically. Just enough to show someone had walked here within the last few days. Orion noticed it too. The dog lowered his nose to the dirt and inhaled slowly. Then he looked up at Elias. Not alarmed, just certain. Someone had been here. Recently. Elias placed one boot on the first step of the staircase. The metal groaned softly under his weight. Orion climbed ahead of him without hesitation. The ascent took longer than expected. The staircase wrapped around the tower in narrow flights, forcing Elias to climb steadily upward through the open air. With every level, the forest spread farther below them, turning into an endless green sea of treetops. Wind brushed cold against Elias's face. By the time they reached the top platform, the valley stretched in every direction. The observation cabin sat at the summit, a small wooden structure with wide windows on all sides. Elias tried the door. It opened immediately. No lock, no resistance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old electronics. But something was wrong. The room was too clean. A thin layer of age covered the floorboards, but the main work desk looked recently wiped. A chair had been pushed neatly beneath the desk. Even the windows had fewer smudges than Elias expected. This place had not been abandoned. Not completely. Orion moved through the room slowly. The German shepherd's nose hovered inches above the floor as he inspected each corner. His harness straps creaked faintly as he turned. Then he stopped near a second door along the back wall. The door had a metal plate bolted across its center. The engraving read. Elias reached into his pocket. The brass key Caldwell had given him felt heavier now than it had in the conference room. He slid it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a dull metallic click. The radio room was smaller than the main cabin, but it was far more crowded. Old communication equipment filled the space. An analog signal receiver with rows of metal switches, a weathered control panel covered in faded frequency markings, a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Bundles of cables snaked along the walls like sleeping vines. Everything looked decades old, yet nothing appeared broken. Elias stepped inside. Orion followed, his claws clicking lightly on the wooden floor. Elias ran a hand across the control panel. Dust coated his fingers, but the switches moved smoothly. Someone had maintained the equipment. Carefully. He pressed the power switch. The machine hummed to life. Static filled the room immediately. A constant whisper of radio noise, signals drifting through the mountains. For several seconds, nothing happened. Just the sound of empty frequencies. Then the tape recorder clicked. The reels began turning. A woman's voice emerged from the speaker, old but clear. "If you're hearing this, Elias, then I suppose I didn't get the chance to explain things in person." Elias remained very still. Orion sat beside him. Margaret's voice continued. "I spent 20 years listening to radio calls for the Forest Service. Most were ordinary things. Weather updates, fire reports, lost hikers." She paused. "But sometimes I heard things that weren't meant for official channels." The tape crackled softly. "People in small towns talk differently when they believe no one is listening." Elias leaned closer to the speaker. Margaret's voice lowered slightly. "I began recording those conversations, not because I wanted to expose anyone." Another pause. "But because I wanted to make sure the truth never disappeared completely." The reel slowed, then stopped. The room fell silent again. Orion stood abruptly, his ears snapped forward. The dog walked quickly to the cabin window overlooking the north slope of the mountain. Elias followed. Far below the tower, near the edge of the forest clearing, a man stood beside the tree line. He was too far away to see clearly, but the figure was unmistakable. The man was looking directly up at the tower, at Elias, at Orion. Neither moved. For several seconds, the man remained perfectly still. Then he turned and stepped back into the forest. Gone. Orion's gaze remained fixed on the place where the figure had disappeared. The dog did not bark, but the fur along his spine had lifted. Elias exhaled slowly. Someone knew he was here. He turned back toward the radio equipment. The tape recorder sat quiet on the desk. For a moment, Elias considered shutting everything down, but something about the room held him in place. The equipment, the recordings, the years Margaret had spent listening to voices drifting through the forest. He reached for the receiver dial and adjusted the frequency slightly. Static crackled louder, then faded. Then, the radio snapped alive. Not a recording. A live transmission. A man's voice, low, calm, and unmistakably directed at him. "Fire Tower 17. The voice paused. "I know you're up there." Elias did not respond. The voice continued. "You might want to listen carefully before you decide what to do next." The signal cut abruptly. Static returned. Orion turned his head slowly toward Elias. The dog's amber eyes were alert now, focused. Elias stared at the silent radio. Someone out there had just spoken directly to him, and they had known exactly where he was. By the time Elias Mercer descended from Fire Tower 17, the afternoon sun had already begun its slow drop toward the western ridge. The forest looked different from above. From the tower, the valley had seemed calm and almost peaceful. But down on the mountain trail, surrounded by towering pines and the smell of damp soil, the woods felt heavier, older, like a place that remembered things people preferred to forget. Orion moved ahead of Elias along the narrow path. The German shepherd's gait was quiet and deliberate. His yellow-black coat caught flashes of sunlight between the branches, and his ears stayed upright, constantly adjusting to the sounds of the forest. Every few yards he paused, listening. Elias knew that rhythm well. Orion had worked patrols before Elias ever met him, trained to detect changes in environments that human senses often missed. The dog wasn't frightened, but he was alert, which meant something had changed since they climbed the tower. Elias reached the truck just as the first shadows from the mountains began stretching across the valley floor. He opened the passenger door. Orion jumped in smoothly and settled into his usual position, though his head remained lifted toward the forest road ahead. Elias drove slowly back toward town. Brightwood Ridge looked ordinary again. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. A pickup truck idled outside the hardware store while two men loaded lumber into the bed. The diner's windows glowed warmly against the cooling air. But Elias could not shake the feeling that the town was quietly observing him, waiting. He parked outside a narrow storefront halfway down Main Street. The faded wooden sign above the door read, "The shop looked older than most of the buildings around it." The windows displayed a strange collection of outdated equipment: shortwave radios, weather receivers, tangled antenna cables, and even a few antique microphones mounted on small wooden stands. Orion stepped out of the truck first. His nose lifted immediately. The scent of warm metal, dust, and machine oil drifted from the open doorway. Inside, the shop smelled like history. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with radios from different decades. Some were bulky military models painted dull green. Others were civilian units from the 70s, their plastic knobs yellowed with age. Behind a cluttered workbench stood a man who looked as though he had spent most of his life surrounded by this equipment. Thomas was in his early 60s, thin to the point of appearing almost fragile. His posture leaned slightly forward, the result of years spent bending over circuit boards and delicate wiring. His hair had once been dark, but had faded into a tangled gray that seemed permanently resistant to combs. He wore thick, round glasses and a faded denim jacket with oil stains on both sleeves. Beneath it was a wool sweater patched at the elbows. His hands were long and careful, the fingers permanently darkened by machine grease. Thomas looked up as Elias entered. His eyes moved first to the dog, then to Elias. "You're Margaret's grandson," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded. "Elias Mercer." Thomas studied his face for a moment. "Figured you'd come eventually." Orion walked slowly around the shop, inspecting the corners. His tail moved once as he sniffed a stack of old radio receivers. Thomas noticed. "That dog's listening," he said. Elias raised an eyebrow. "He's smelling electronics." Thomas shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "He's listening." The old technician gestured toward a small stool near the workbench. "Sit." Elias did. Thomas wiped his hands on a rag before leaning against the counter. "I worked with your grandmother for 20 years, he said, back when the Forest Service still relied on lookout towers. Elias waited. Thomas's eyes drifted toward one of the radios on the shelf. "Margaret Mercer had the best ears in the region," he continued. "Not physically, but she understood signals." He tapped the side of the radio. "Most people hear static when they tune frequencies. Margaret heard patterns." Elias leaned forward slightly. "What kind of patterns?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "The kind that told her when someone was lying." Thomas explained that Margaret's job had been to monitor radio traffic across the mountains. Wildfire crews, rescue teams, park rangers. But radio waves didn't care about job titles. They carried everything. Truck drivers talking to each other across logging roads, hunters coordinating in the forest, private companies moving equipment through mountain passes, and sometimes people who believed no one was listening. "Your grandmother heard everything," Thomas said quietly, not because she wanted to spy on anyone, but because radio doesn't have walls. Elias considered that. So she recorded it. Thomas nodded. At first, just notes, then tapes. He pointed toward a dusty reel recorder sitting behind the counter. She kept records of conversations that didn't sound right. Elias thought of the recording in the tower. Illegal logging, hidden accidents, land deals. Thomas continued. There were men in this town who didn't appreciate someone listening so closely. But Margaret never used those recordings. Elias frowned. Why keep them? Thomas's eyes softened. Because she believed truth should exist somewhere. At that moment, Orion froze. The German shepherd's ears angled sharply toward a small, portable receiver sitting on the corner of Thomas's desk. The device hadn't been turned on, yet Orion stared at it as though it were speaking. Thomas noticed the dog's behavior immediately. He frowned and stepped toward the radio. That's odd, he muttered. He adjusted the dial. The receiver suddenly crackled to life, not with voices, but with a repeating sound. 3 short beeps, a pause, 3 more. Elias leaned closer. That's not a broadcast, he said. Thomas shook his head slowly. No. It's a locator signal. Orion's tail flicked once. The dog's eyes were fixed on the radio. Elias listened carefully. The tone repeated again and again. Thomas grabbed a small notebook and wrote down the signal timing. Then he looked up at Elias. That pattern isn't random, he said. It's coordinates. Thomas spent the next 20 minutes adjusting equipment and converting the signal into a map reference. When he finished, he slid the paper across the desk. The location sat several miles north of the tower, deep in the forest. Elias studied the map. What's there? Thomas shook his head. Nothing that's supposed to be. Elias folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Then I guess we should find out. The drive north took longer than expected. Forest roads twisted through thick pine stands and narrow ravines. By the time Elias reached the coordinates Thomas had marked, the sunlight had turned golden against the treetops. He parked near a clearing. Orion jumped down immediately. The dog sniffed the air once, then walked straight into the trees. Elias followed. The forest grew denser with every step. Branches blocked the light. Fallen logs created natural barriers across the forest floor. But Orion never hesitated. 10 minutes later, the dog stopped. Elias nearly walked past him before noticing. The ground looked ordinary, just dirt and pine needles. But Orion pawed once at the soil. Elias crouched. He brushed aside the loose debris. Metal appeared beneath the surface, a square steel hatch. Rust had darkened the edges, but the center remained intact. Elias cleared the rest of the dirt. Stamped into the metal were 4 words. U.S. The Forest Service Archive. Orion stepped back and sat quietly beside the hatch. His amber eyes looked up at Elias. Waiting. Elias placed his hand against the cold steel. Whatever Margaret Mercer had been listening to, it had led here. And for the first time since arriving in Brightwood Ridge, Elias realized something. The tower had never been the destination. It had only been the beginning. The steel hatch was colder than Elias expected. When his fingers touched the metal, the chill traveled through the worn fabric of his tactical shirt and into his palm, as if the earth itself had been storing winter beneath the forest floor. Orion remained seated beside him. The German shepherd's posture was alert but controlled, his amber eyes watching the surrounding woods rather than the hatch itself. His ears pivoted slowly with each distant sound: wind through pine needles, the creak of a branch, the faint call of a bird settling for evening. Elias brushed the remaining dirt away from the hatch handle. The mechanism was older than modern equipment, but still solid. The metal wheel turned with a heavy grinding sound, resisting at first, before finally loosening with a slow, metallic groan. The lid lifted. Cool air escaped from the opening. Not stale, not rotten, just cold, which meant the chamber below had been sealed well. A narrow ladder descended into darkness. Elias pulled a small flashlight from the pocket of his combat pants and switched it on. The beam cut through the shadows: concrete walls, metal shelving, boxes, rows of them. Orion stood immediately and stepped forward, lowering his nose toward the ladder. The dog sniffed carefully, testing the air before descending first. Elias followed. The underground room was larger than Elias expected. Rough concrete walls surrounded a space roughly the size of a small garage. Shelving units lined the perimeter, each filled with carefully organized containers: metal archive boxes, plastic storage bins, and old cardboard crates reinforced with duct tape. A long work table stood in the center of the room. On it rested several reel-to-reel tape recorders and stacks of labeled tapes. Elias moved slowly through the space. Everything had been arranged with deliberate care. Each shelf was labeled in Margaret Mercer's handwriting. Fire reports, 1987 to 1993. Weather logs, Northern. Ridge Search and Rescue Dispatch. Margaret had turned the underground room into a library of sound, a record of voices, decades of them. Orion moved along the edges of the room, sniffing each corner with methodical patience. The dog's body language remained focused, but calm, which meant no immediate threat. Elias approached the work table. One group of tapes caught his attention. Unlike the others, these reels were separated from the rest and stored in a small metal case. Each one carried the same label written in dark blue ink. Elias frowned. He opened the case. Inside were 6 tapes, each marked with a different date. The oldest one read. Elias carefully placed the reel onto the tape recorder. The machine clicked as the spool engaged. Static filled the room. Then voices, military voices, clear, disciplined. Team Bravo moving to secondary position. Thermal sweep negative. Possible hostage movement west side. Elias froze. He recognized the tone immediately. That was tactical communication. Military, naval, SEAL radio traffic. But something felt wrong. The location being described over the radio was not a desert or foreign city. It was forest terrain, mountain forest, the kind surrounding Brightwood Ridge. The recording continued. "This is command. Confirm extraction route." The voice cut off abruptly. Another voice replaced it, panic beneath control. "We've lost contact with Team 3. Then silence. The tape stopped. Elias sat back slowly. His gray-blue eyes narrowed as he stared at the machine. He had served over a decade in the Navy, and in all that time, he had never heard of a SEAL mission anywhere near this region, which meant one thing: the operation had never been made public. Orion suddenly rose. The German shepherd's ears snapped upright. His nose lifted toward the ladder leading to the surface. Elias saw the change immediately. Orion's entire body had shifted, alert, listening. Someone was above them. Orion moved toward the ladder. But instead of barking or charging upward, the dog did something unusual. He sat, directly at the base of the ladder, perfectly still, watching the opening above. The kind of behavior Orion used when he was certain someone was near, but not yet dangerous. Elias switched off the tape recorder. The room fell silent again. Then came the sound. Footsteps. 3 sets. Slow. Deliberate. Dust drifted down from the hatch as shadows crossed the opening. Elias stepped away from the table, his posture relaxed, but ready. Years of training settled quietly into place. Orion did not move. The first figure appeared at the top of the ladder, then another, then a third. They climbed down one by one. The first man Elias recognized immediately. Up close, Kettering looked even more controlled than he had inside the law office. The tall timber executive's blonde hair was perfectly combed despite the forest wind, and his green field jacket hung neatly over his shoulders like a uniform rather than workwear. His expression remained polite, but his eyes had hardened. Behind him descended 2 larger men. Both looked like professional security rather than lumber workers. The first was a thick-shouldered man in his early 40s with a shaved head and a dark beard that covered most of his jawline. His nose had been broken at least once, giving his face a slightly crooked appearance. He wore a black flannel shirt over a gray thermal layer and heavy work boots. His name, as Elias would soon learn, was Darren Cole, a former private security contractor who had spent several years working overseas before returning to Montana. The second man was younger, perhaps 30, lean but muscular. His hair was cut short, and his face carried a permanent sunburn from long hours outdoors. A faint scar ran along his left eyebrow, giving him a constant half-squint. This man was Luke Mercer, no relation to Elias, one of Kettering's site supervisors in the timber operation. Luke said nothing, but his eyes moved constantly around the room, cataloging, measuring. Harold Kettering reached the floor of the chamber and brushed dust from his jacket sleeve. "Quite a collection," he said calmly. His voice echoed softly off the concrete walls. Elias said nothing. Orion remained seated, watching. Harold's gaze drifted toward the shelves of recordings, then to the tape recorder on the table. "Margaret Mercer," he said quietly. "She had a habit of keeping things." Elias crossed his arms. "Like history." Harold gave a small smile. "History can be dangerous." The 2 security men remained near the ladder, blocking the only exit. Elias noticed. Of course. Harold stepped closer to the table and picked up one of the tapes labeled Seal Frequency. He examined the handwriting carefully, then looked back at Elias. "Your grandmother had excellent hearing." His tone remained calm, but the tension in the room had thickened. Harold placed the tape back into the case. Then he met Elias's eyes directly. "Unfortunately," he said softly, "she kept recordings that should never have existed." Elias held his gaze. "What recordings?" Harold's expression darkened. "The kind that ruin people's lives." He gestured slowly toward the shelves. "All of this. Voices, deals, accidents. Things people said when they believed no one was listening." Orion stood, not aggressively, just enough to place himself between Elias and the 3 men. The dog's ears were forward, his body relaxed but ready. Harold watched the German shepherd for a moment. Then he nodded slightly. "A disciplined animal," he said. Elias did not respond. Harold's eyes returned to the archive boxes. "Margaret Mercer understood something important," he continued. "In a town like this, truth can destroy more than lies. He paused, then added quietly, but sometimes truth destroys the wrong people. Elias felt the weight of the room settle around him. All the recordings, all the voices Margaret had preserved, and the men now standing between him and the exit. Harold's voice dropped slightly. Your grandmother kept secrets that should have died years ago. He folded his hands calmly, then spoke the words that had clearly been waiting for Elias since the moment he arrived in town. Margaret Mercer kept things that should never have existed. The underground chamber had grown heavier, not because the air had changed, but because the words inside it had. Harold Kettering stood calmly near the center table where Margaret Mercer's tapes rested. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the concrete floor, and the soft hum of the tape recorder motor seemed louder in the silence. Elias Mercer remained where he was, his posture relaxed but balanced, the way years of military discipline had taught him to stand when tension filled a room. Orion stood beside him. The German shepherd's body was slightly forward now, shoulders squared, amber eyes shifting between the three men and the narrow ladder that led back to daylight. He was not growling, but the message in his stance was clear. The room belonged to Elias. Anyone entering it did so at risk. Harold glanced once at the dog. Still the professional type, he said. Elias didn't answer. Harold exhaled quietly and turned toward the shelves lining the walls. Rows of labeled tapes rested there like silent witnesses to decades of conversations drifting through the mountains. You've probably figured out some of it already, Harold said. His voice was controlled, almost thoughtful. Your grandmother listened to everything that passed through those radios. Elias crossed his arms. That's what dispatchers do. Harold nodded. Yes, but most dispatchers forget what they hear after the shift ends. He picked up one of the tapes and turned it slowly between his fingers. Margaret never forgot anything. Behind Harold, Darren Cole shifted his weight slightly. The big security contractor leaned against the wall with folded arms, his heavy beard casting a shadow across his thick jaw. His expression remained neutral, but the broken line of his nose hinted at a man who had seen enough fights to stop enjoying them. Luke Mercer, Kettering's younger supervisor, remained near the ladder, watching the conversation carefully. His lean build and restless eyes made him look less like a guard and more like someone who had been placed here because he knew the terrain. Harold set the tape down again. About 25 years ago, he began. A group of logging contractors made a decision. He paused. A bad one. Elias waited. Harold continued slowly. A mountainside north of here was marked as protected forest. But the timber there was worth millions. Darren let out a short breath that sounded halfway between a laugh and a sigh. People make stupid decisions when money gets involved. Harold ignored him. The logging crew moved equipment into the area after midnight, he said. They cut trees they weren't allowed to cut. Elias could already guess the rest. And something went wrong. Harold nodded. One of the machines slipped on wet rock. The room fell quiet again. A man died. No one spoke for a few seconds. Orion's ears shifted slightly as the wind outside rustled through the forest above. Harold continued. They buried the accident under paperwork, changed the location in the reports, claimed it happened on a legal site. And most people in town accepted that version. Elias glanced toward the shelves, but Margaret heard the radio calls. Harold nodded again. She heard the panic, the arguments, the attempts to rewrite the story before the authorities arrived. He gestured around the room. She recorded everything. Elias felt the weight of the archive pressing in from every wall. Margaret Mercer had been sitting alone in a tower, listening to voices that believed they were safe, and she had preserved them. Orion suddenly moved, not aggressively, but with sudden focus. The German shepherd walked to the far corner of the archive room where an old steel cabinet stood partially hidden behind stacked boxes. He lowered his nose to the floor, then looked back at Elias. Once, twice. The dog tapped the cabinet lightly with one paw. Elias frowned. That wasn't a warning behavior. It was something else. Recognition. Elias stepped over and pulled the cabinet door open. Inside, behind several folders, lay a single photograph. Old, slightly curled at the edges. Elias lifted it carefully. The picture showed a younger Margaret Mercer standing beside a radio tower. But she wasn't alone. 3 men stood behind her, all wearing Forest Service jackets. One of them was Sheriff Nolan Briggs, much younger, his hair still dark. The second man Elias didn't recognize. The third man. Elias slowly turned the photo toward Harold. "You were there." Harold's eyes narrowed. For the first time since entering the chamber, the timber executive looked uncomfortable. Harold took the photograph from Elias and studied it for a moment. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. Darren shifted again. Luke. Mercer's gaze moved between the 2 men. Harold placed the photograph back into the cabinet. "That logging accident didn't just kill a man," he said. "It nearly destroyed this town." Elias frowned. "Explain." Harold gestured toward the valley above them. "Brightwood Ridge depends on timber. Always has. If federal investigators had discovered what happened on that mountain, half the companies operating here would have been shut down." Darren added bluntly, "Which means half the town would have lost their jobs." Harold nodded. Margaret understood that. She had the evidence to expose everything. But she never did. Elias stared at him. She chose silence. Harold corrected him. "No. She chose balance." The word hung in the air. Harold walked slowly toward the ladder. Margaret Mercer understood something most people don't. Truth is powerful. But releasing it without thinking can destroy innocent people too. Elias felt Orion shift slightly beside him. The dog's presence was steady, grounded. Harold looked back one last time. She kept those recordings as insurance, to make sure certain men never forgot what they'd done. Darren pushed himself off the wall. Luke Mercer stepped aside near the ladder. Harold rested one hand on the steel rungs. "And now you've inherited that responsibility." Elias said nothing. Harold climbed upward toward the fading daylight. Darren followed. Luke Mercer paused briefly before stepping onto the ladder. His eyes met Elias's for a moment. There was no hostility in them, only caution. Then he climbed after the others. The hatch closed above. Silence returned. Elias stood alone in the archive. Orion moved closer to him and sat down, leaning lightly against his leg. The room seemed smaller now, not physically, but morally. Margaret Mercer had spent decades holding a secret that could have destroyed lives, not to control people, but to prevent worse damage. Elias ran a hand across the top of the nearest shelf. His fingers brushed the labels. Years, voices, truth, responsibility. He finally turned toward the ladder. Orion climbed ahead of him again. When Elias pushed the hatch open, the air outside had cooled. Evening was approaching. The forest stood quiet around the clearing. The truck waited where he had parked it. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Orion stopped halfway down the trail. The German shepherd lifted his head toward the ridge. His nose twitched. Elias noticed immediately. The dog's posture had shifted again. Different this time. More serious. Orion stared toward the mountains above Brightwood Ridge. The wind carried something faint through the trees. Elias inhaled slowly. It took him a moment to recognize the scent. Smoke. Not the sharp scent of a campfire. Something heavier. Something distant. Orion's ears tilted forward. The dog didn't move. He simply watched the mountain. And Elias realized something at the same moment. Fire Tower 17 stood directly in the direction the wind was blowing from. The smell of smoke grew stronger overnight. Elias Mercer noticed it before sunrise. He had slept only a few hours inside the old fire tower, stretched across a narrow cot that Margaret Mercer must have used for decades. The tower's wooden walls creaked softly as the mountain wind moved around them, and the cold northern air slipped through the gaps between old beams. Orion was already awake. The 5-year-old German shepherd sat beside the window platform that circled the tower's observation room. His yellow-black coat caught the pale morning light, the darker saddle along his back standing out sharply against the fading snow on the mountainside. The dog's ears were raised, still, listening. Elias pushed himself upright, the old military watch on his wrist ticking quietly in the silence. He stepped toward the window. At first he saw only the forest stretching north of Brightwood Ridge, endless rows of pine trees climbing toward the mountains. Then he saw it. Faint gray column rising through the trees. Smoke. Not campfire smoke. Too thick, too wide. Elias narrowed his gray-blue eyes. Damn. Orion let out a low breath. Not quite a growl, not quite a warning, more like confirmation. Elias grabbed the binoculars that hung from a rusted nail beside the window. The lenses were old, but clear. Through them he saw flashes of orange deep in the forest. Flames. A wildfire had started somewhere beyond the northern ridge. He lowered the binoculars slowly. Brightwood Ridge sat directly downwind. Within 20 minutes, Elias had powered up the tower's radio system. The equipment Margaret Mercer had left behind looked old enough to belong in a museum. Analog switches, metal dials, thick copper wiring running into the wall like veins. But the system worked. Thomas Vale proved that. The radio technician arrived first. Thomas Vale was a thin, pale man in his late 60s, with silver hair that refused to stay combed. His shoulders were narrow and his hands slightly shaky, but the moment he saw the radio board, his entire posture changed. He moved like a man stepping back into a familiar life. "Good Lord," Thomas murmured, adjusting his round glasses. "I haven't seen this model running in 15 years." Thomas had spent most of his working life repairing emergency communication systems across Montana. Margaret Mercer had been one of the few people he respected deeply. He ran his fingers along the switches. "She kept this maintained." Elias nodded. "She expected someone to need it again." Thomas gave him a sideways look. "She probably expected you." Sheriff Nolan Briggs arrived next. The sheriff climbed the tower stairs slowly, his boots heavy on the metal steps. Briggs was in his early 60s now, tall, broad-shouldered, with deep lines across his face carved by decades of mountain winters. His hair had turned completely white, but the sharpness in his steel gray eyes had never faded. A thin scar ran along his jawline, a leftover from a long-forgotten bar fight during his early deputy days. He removed his hat when he entered the radio room. "Smoke's spreading faster than we thought," he said. Elias nodded toward the windows. "I see it. Briggs looked at the radio board. You think this old tower can still coordinate? Thomas answered before Elias could. It can. He tapped the console. If the wires still reach the valley stations, we can talk to every fire crew within 60 miles. Briggs gave a small, satisfied nod. Then let's wake the county. The next person through the door surprised Elias. Luke Avery climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Luke was young, maybe 24, with sunburned skin and a lean, athletic frame built by long days working outdoors. His blonde hair stuck out beneath a firefighter helmet he carried under one arm. His face still had the restless energy of someone new to responsibility. But his eyes were steady. I heard you needed hands, he said. Luke Avery had joined the volunteer fire department only 2 years earlier. He was known around town as the kid who never turned down a call, even when it meant working 24 hours straight. Elias studied him for a moment. You know how to run a dispatch board? Luke shook his head. No. But I learned fast. Thomas snorted softly. Good enough. Within the hour, Fire Tower 17 was alive again. Radios crackled across the room. Voices poured in from across the valley. County fire units, Forest Service patrol teams, volunteer crews. Thomas worked the frequencies like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Unit 4, move east. Dozer team, stay clear of the ridge. Sheriff Briggs coordinated road closures from a secondary line. Luke Avery relayed evacuation updates from the volunteer department, and Elias Mercer stood at the observation window with binoculars. Orion sat beside him, watching the forest. The dog's body was alert, but calm, as if he understood the tower had returned to its purpose. Below them, Brightwood Ridge began to move. Fire trucks rolled through the streets. Residents loaded vehicles. Smoke thickened on the horizon. But for the first time in years, the old tower was guiding the response. Around midday, Orion suddenly turned away from the window. The dog walked slowly across the radio room, past the dispatch board, past the staircase. He stopped at the narrow hallway leading to the old recording room Margaret had used. His ears lifted, his body stilled. Elias noticed immediately. Orion? The dog looked back once, then nudged the door open with his nose. Inside the small recording room, dust floated through the sunlight from a narrow window. On the desk sat a single cassette tape. Elias frowned. He had already searched this room yesterday. That tape hadn't been there. The label was handwritten, Margaret Mercer's handwriting. Elias picked it up. On the label were only 4 words. For the day fire returns. Elias stared at it quietly. Then he slid the tape into the recorder. Margaret's voice filled the room, older, calm. If you are hearing this, Elias, then the tower is alive again. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. Margaret continued, Fire will always come to these mountains. But what matters is whether someone is watching. Elias closed his eyes briefly. Outside, the radios kept calling. But for a moment, the tower felt very quiet. By late afternoon, the fire crews gained control of the northern blaze. Wind conditions shifted. The fire lines held. Smoke still hung over the mountains, but the danger to Brightwood Ridge had passed. When the last radio call ended, the tower finally fell silent. Luke Avery leaned against the wall, exhausted but smiling. Did we actually just run a county dispatch center from a tower older than my dad? Thomas chuckled. Kid, that tower coordinated fires before you were born. Sheriff Briggs looked out the window toward the valley. The town below was calm again. Lights flickered on across the streets. He turned toward Elias. Your grandmother would have liked today. Elias didn't answer immediately. He walked into the recording room again. The tape Margaret left had stopped, but the recorder still hummed softly. He rewound it, pressed play. Margaret's voice spoke once more. If the town is still standing when you hear this, then it means people chose to help each other again. Elias looked around the tower, Thomas adjusting the radio, Luke staring out the window with quiet pride, Briggs leaning on the railing like a man remembering old days. Margaret Mercer had been right. The tower had never just been about watching fires. It had been about keeping people connected. Evening settled slowly over the mountains. The sky turned gold behind the distant ridges. Thomas and Luke eventually headed down to town. Sheriff Briggs lingered a moment longer. He paused at the door. "You planning to keep the tower running?" Elias nodded. "Yes." Briggs smiled faintly. "Good." Then he left. The tower grew quiet again. Orion stretched near the doorway, resting his head on his paws. For the first time since arriving in Brightwood Ridge, the dog's ears relaxed completely. The tension had left his body. Elias stepped back into the radio room and began powering down the equipment. Switches clicked off one by one. Lights dimmed. The room returned to silence. He reached for the final switch. Then, the radio speaker crackled. Elias froze. The system had already been powered down, yet a signal pushed through the static. A very faint transmission from a distant frequency. A voice spoke. "Fire Tower 17. The signal wavered through the noise. "Is anyone still listening?" Orion's head lifted instantly. His ears snapped forward again. Elias slowly turned toward the radio panel. The signal strength meter flickered weakly. This transmission wasn't coming from anywhere nearby. It was far. Very far. Elias leaned closer to the microphone. For a moment, he didn't answer. Instead, he looked through the tower window toward the endless mountains beyond Brightwood Ridge. Then he pressed the transmit button. The tower light above the radio blinked on. And Elias finally understood something Margaret Mercer must have known long ago. Fire Tower 17 had never just been listening to this town. It had been listening to the world. Sometimes the greatest battles in life are not fought with weapons, but with conscience. Elias Mercer came to Brightwood Ridge carrying the weight of a past mission he believed he had failed. He thought he had returned only to settle a family matter and leave again. But the truth waiting in that old fire tower revealed something deeper. Sometimes God places us in a place not to run from our past, but to transform it into purpose. Margaret Mercer understood something that many people forget. Truth is powerful, but wisdom is knowing when to speak it and when to protect others from the harm it might cause. She listened when others ignored the quiet signals around them. She kept the light on when no one else was watching. And in the end, that light saved the town. Life often works the same way. In our daily lives, we face moments where no one seems to be watching. Moments when honesty, courage, and compassion feel harder than silence. But those are the moments where character is built. The moments where faith becomes real. Sometimes the miracle is not a sudden sign from heaven. Sometimes the miracle is a person who chooses to do the right thing quietly, faithfully, day after day. Maybe you have faced a moment like Elias did, a moment when you wondered if your past mistakes defined you. But God often writes a different ending than the one we fear. What feels like failure can become the beginning of a calling. Fire Tower 17 was never just a tower. It was a reminder that someone must always be watching, listening, and caring for others. In our own lives, we can be that light for someone else. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the people in your life who quietly protect and guide others. Share this story with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us what part of the story spoke to you the most. And if you believe that stories about courage, faith, and second chances matter, consider subscribing to the channel so more people can hear them. May God bless you, guide your path, and bring peace and protection to you and your family wherever you are watching from.